I tried to pack a lot in this hour, so please raise your hand if things are confusing. If you have questions, please do so. If it exceeds to an hour a little bit, please feel free to leave. I understand it's Friday afternoon. All right, so today I will talk about improving police decision making under stress and how we can apply neuroscience into police training. All right, so today's talk, it will be in two parts. In part one, I'll talk a little bit about the stress response, what's acute stress, what's chronic stress, and then how acute and chronic stress impairs decision making. In part two, I will talk about science-backed tools to mitigate stress and improve decision making under stress. And some of the tools that I will mention are breathing techniques, meditation, hypnosis, mindset interventions, and training. This is not by all means an exhaustive list of everything we can do, but these are some that I picked based on being heavily science-backed and also what I thought could apply best to law enforcement. All right. Part one, the stress response and its consequences. So there's quite a bit of myths about stress. Stress is used very vaguely and widely in a lot of contexts. Good stress, bad stress, low stress, high stress, being stressed out. So what is stress? How do we define it? So stress is an actually adaptive response. So it's a good thing to a challenge. So it's our body's or mind's adaptive response to a challenge. It could be a call that you're going to, it could be a public speaking challenge, and it doesn't matter however your brain interprets as a challenge, it's gonna activate two main biological pathways presented here. On the left is the fast pathway. It's driven by the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis. We call it, you know, that's the pathway that causes your heart increase. It's adrenaline driven. It's fast because it is a direct connection from your brainstem through your spinal cord directly to your adrenal glands that are located on top of your kidneys, and that release adrenaline into the system. And it acts, you know, within milliseconds to seconds. And that's when, you know, your heart rate increase, pupils dilate, sweating increase, etc. If that's too much, you know, you call it the fight or flight response. Now, stress also activates a slower pathway, and that's maybe you've heard of it, what people refer to as HPA axis. It's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's slower because it's hormonally driven. It's hormones, there's a cascade of hormones being released from your brain to multiple places, and then finally adrenal gland, and releases cortisol into the system. So we have cortisol that is responsible, sort of the slower scale changes, and then we have adrenaline that are responsible for the fast scale changes. And typically, the cortisol impacts anything that is, again, changing on a slower scale, such as mood, appetite, metabolism, sleep, immune, relationships, that's impacted by cortisol release. All right. Now, stress can be acute or chronic, and both of these can have negative consequences, and law enforcement officers are unfortunately at high risk for developing negative consequences due to both of these things. So what are the differences? Acute stress, clearly it's short-lived. It's usually what we are talking about when we're talking about a scenario-based training, during a scenario or during an incident. That's the acute stress. Chronic stress, long-lived, it's ever-present, it's always there. Trigger. Acute stress can be tied directly to an identifiable trigger. So you can say, this is what triggered me. Chronic stress, difficult to identify what triggered you, or that there is no trigger, you can still be stressed. It's more what we call the stressed out, right? Mechanism, driven by the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, that I just talked about. That's the acute stress. Chronic stress, driven primarily by an overactive HPA axis. So if you're constantly getting stressors, constantly being stressed, your HPA axis won't have enough time to recover, and therefore you will be chronically stressed. Impact. Acute stress is absolutely necessary for high performance, so you need the adrenaline to perform well, but needs to be regulated. So if it's not regulated, it can lead to two things. One, it can impair your decision making if it's too high all of a sudden. Two, it can lead to chronic stress because you're not regulating properly after there's just too many events back to back, and it just leads to being chronic at the end. chronic stress always degrades performance, so it's bad. It leads to physical and mental health problems, depression, anxiety, and many more. There is quite a bit of science that shows that acute stress impairs police decision making and performance. This is why we are here talking about this, right? These are just some papers that came out. I just wanted to point anxiety, which in this case they're really referring to that acute response during a scenario, is associated with increases in mistake of fact shooting, so people don't remember their facts or don't get their facts right during an incident. Is associated with perceptual distortions, memory deficits. All of these contribute, of course, to decision making. It's associated with decreased accuracy with firearms and also motor skills, such as putting a tourniquet on somebody or putting a handcuffs on somebody, right? So it impairs all of these things, associated with all of these things. And chronic stress, also an issue in law enforcement. These are just a few statistics I could find real quickly, but all of these, substance use disorder, PTSD, suicide and heart attack, risks for all of these things that are driven by chronic stress are almost all doubled compared to the general population. So if you look here, 10% is risk of developing a substance use disorder in the general population. It's 20 to 30% for police officers, and the same thing for all of the other ones. All right, so what can we, so in this part, now we know that this is relevant, right? Hopefully I convinced you. So let's talk about, go a little bit deeper about the neurobiology of why acute stress impairs our decision making. So I'll take a step back here to talk about decision making. There are really, when we are making a particular decision, there are really two ways of doing it, right? One is an impulsive decision, impulsive mode, and then the other one is what I call a situational mode, or it's more a cognitive decision. And so under the impulsive mode, we are reflexive, right? We're not thinking. We're certainly seeking. We're intolerant of risk or ambiguity. We just want to end the situation. Working memory inactive. What that means is you're not pulling out what you learned from your training, for example, that's in your memory, into the current situation. You're also not pulling any new facts into the current situation. You're basically just acting out of most likely bias or what you did before and what worked. And from a sensory perspective, this is when this is associated with tunnel vision or auditory exclusion. So you just focus on one thing. Now the situational mode, the cognitive brain, is pretty much the opposite in all of those things. So now we can sit back and relax. We have high tolerance for ambiguity. We can do risk calculations and choose what's the best course of action. It's goal-directed, it's strategic. Working memory is active, which means you can remember things from your training. Peripheral vision is active. You're able to, it's literally and figuratively, you can look at the whole thing and not just one thing, right? Now, these two modes are controlled by different neural networks. Different parts of the brain controls these two modes of decision making, okay? The habitual or the instinctive mode is controlled by what we call the saliency network. So saliency network is, maybe you've heard of it, is the limbic system, the emotional brain, whatever you want to call it. It's the part of the brain that really evolved to get your attention to something. That's what it's like, what's salient in the environment, right? It gets activated, and it also controls that impulsive decision making. Now, the situational decision making is controlled by a different network called executive control network. Now, the important thing to know here is that for a particular decision, only one of these is dominant, okay? So you can't have both, you have to choose. And so that's the challenge, right? And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective because, you know, if you need to run for your life, you don't have time to sit down and think of all the options. But if you're making a decision that will have long-term consequences on your family and your kids and your life, then you really don't want to avoid risks. You want to calculate the risks. You want to, you know, make a conscious decision. So that's why they evolved. Now, what stress does in the acute sense, and also chronic sense, is it shifts to decision making to the impulsive mode by activating the salience network. Okay, so once there is some threat, salience network is activated. Okay, now this is not an all or nothing thing in the sense of one is dominant, but the other one can be still active, and I'll talk about that. But it just shifts the spectrum a little bit to the saliency network. Is that clear so far? Do you guys have any questions following me? Okay. All right, so what happens? Saliency network is activated. We're now certainty seeking. We want to end the situation. We are relying on our prior biases. We're not thinking about our training. We're not thinking about the new situation. We're likely tunnel vision. It depends on how far off we are on that spectrum. And everything on the right side that we associate with good decision making goes down. If you go really high on the salience network activation, that's when you enter the fight or flight zone, right? Then you really narrow down your options to a few things: fight, flight, or freeze. Is another one, but not too many options in the brain that you can actually do. You can access. All right, so far so good. So let's talk about the threat response. So here I'll talk about something called the threat imminence theory that was originated in mice, where most defensive behaviors, that's where I did my PhD on, is mice defensive behaviors. And then after looking at thousands of mice, I realized, well, we're not that different. So I switched to humans and started looking at humans, and indeed I see we're not different at all, and research supports it. But basically, the threat imminence theory says that our nervous system is wired to select our responses to threats based on the level of perceived threat. Now, the word perceived here is very important because that has high relevance to policing. Threat, you cannot control how high the threat is, but you can control how high you perceive it. And how high you perceive it will directly influence your choice of action. So there are these 4 zones that have been identified. It goes from green to red. Green is when there's no threat present. So in the mouse situation, it's just exploring an area, maybe eating, we're doing our daily things, okay? Then in the yellow zone, it's what we call the vigilance zone. There is a possibility of a threat. We're not sure. In this case, it's mouse smells a fox, okay? The fox is not present yet, but they smell it. So at that point, they change their behavior immediately to a more risk assessment. So they start sniffing around and looking for hiding and etc. Now, if the fox now presents itself, now the threat is present, the mouse moves to a orange zone. And there, usually the behavior is freeze. That is to avoid detection. So the fox doesn't see the mouse yet, it freezes to avoid detection. Or flee if there's a nest available, right? If it's a hiding place available. And then finally, if the fox is attacking, then the mouse really doesn't have any chance, any other shot but to fight back. So this is, you can just think about it as direct, like, based on the perceived level of threat, your actions are predetermined. Now, humans, not much different. We have the same zones, okay? In the no threat zone, we can train, we can strategize. Hopefully we're doing training in a more of a yellow zone, but some training happens in the green zone where we're sitting in a lecture room and there's really no threat, right? You have social engagement, you eat, drink, all that. Vigilance zone is when you maybe receive a call, you don't know if there is a threat, there could be a threat, you don't know, that's your vigilance zone. That's what your brain now can strategize, you're anticipating something to happen, your brain is still working, like your cognitive brain is still working to strategize. In the defensive zone and the threat is present, you're faced with a threat, right? The guy's holding a knife or whatever. Unfortunately, the responses are again, freeze and flee. And if the threat is actually attacking you, the automatic response is fight, okay? So this is just how our untrained everyday minds are wired to do. Now the problem is, for law enforcement, that the officers don't have freeze or flight options. If you can't, unlike most people, you cannot just run away from the scene. Your job is to stay there and handle it. You also don't have the option to freeze, right? Like, so the only option biologically is fight, okay? Well, you can take cover, but that's still not abandoning the scene, like in the sense of mouse running away. Okay, so our biology is telling us to fight. Our job tells us we need situational awareness, conflict resolution, de-escalation, appropriate force option to eliminate the threat, right? So this is difficult. This is, in fact, impossible, I would say. So, consistent with everything what I told you, the data also shows that when police officers are more anxious, they are inclined to shoot. So the probability of a use of force increases as the anxiety level increases, consistent with the threat imminence theory, right? Because you're perceiving it as a high threat, and as a result, you're more likely to shoot. And this is just some preliminary data from my research from with another police department, where after each scenario, we asked officers to assess the level of threat in that scenario. We did 6 scenarios ranging from low threat, medium threat, high threat. And we found that 80%, when people made a mistake in saying this is high threat or this is low threat, where it was actually the other way, 80% of those mistakes resulted from overestimation of threat. And so this is just telling us that this, well, overestimation of threat is actual evidence for the activation of the salience network. Because what salience network does is it focuses us towards threat, it focuses over one thing. We're more likely to overestimate that thing. So this is what's happening in an untrained or not well-trained humans or cops' brain, is we overestimate the threat as we are getting more anxious, okay? Now, okay, what do we do about it? I already told you that your thinking brain is not working, right? It's not accessible, so you cannot really turn it off. And I really love this quote from a book called The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It says, when the alarm bell of the emotional brain keeps signaling that you're in danger, no amount of insight will silence it. I am reminded of the comedy in which a 7-time recidivist in an anger management program extols the virtue of the techniques he's learned. They are great and work terrific as long as you're not really angry, right? And that kind of summarizes the issue for fear and anxiety as well. Now, I will come back to this when we're talking about the interventions, but I just wanted to tie it here as well. We have to practice and train to stay in the yellow zone and be comfortable in the yellow zone. We have to figure out ways what we can do in the yellow zone rather than freeze and flee that we want to do, and not jump to red zone. Because when we jump to red zone, when our anxiety levels exceed a threshold, then we're biologically not capable of thinking at that moment. Knowing your red zone, yellow zone, red zone, everybody's is different, right? So you need to, and we'll talk about self-awareness and things like meditation in the second half, but you really need to know yourself and how your body responds to know where your red zone is. Practice fast self-regulation. So you're in the moment, things are escalating. Self-regulation needs to be fast, right? So breath work is great for that. We'll talk about it in the second half. And then this overestimation of threat is really important because remember, it's the perceived threat intensity, not the actual threat intensity, that matters to the brain. And so confidence, what we can do there is training, right? That's where training comes in, because it gives you confidence that this is something you can overcome. And at that point, your brain doesn't perceive it as a high threat anymore, even though it is a high threat, right? As opposed to somebody who hasn't gotten enough training, they perceive it as a higher threat. All right, so part 1A takeaways. Stress is good, unregulated stress is bad. So generally, stress is good, it's only bad if it's unregulated. A unregulated acute stress will impair decision making by overactivating the salience network and silencing the executive control network, biasing towards use of force. The goal is to train and to remain in the yellow zone. Alright, so that's all about acute stress. Any questions so far? Everything good? Okay. So part B is effects of chronic stress on decision making. So now we're moving to chronic stress and what that does to the brain. Alright, so more brain. So I already told you about the saliency network, and so brain has three main networks, okay? I've already told you about the saliency network. Here I call it the alarm network. That's when it points you to the threat. It's activated by threat. When it's too high, it causes you to not think clearly, etc. The executive control network, I already told you about that. That's the decision-making, task-oriented network. That's staying strategic, goal-oriented thinking. And then a third network you might or might not have heard of, it's not talked about too much, but it's super important, is the default mode network. This is, I call the me network. It's the brain, part of the brain that is active when you're doing nothing, okay? When you're not task engaged. So it goes hand in hand, and when you're engaged in a task, you forget about the me, you just do, right? When you're not engaged in a task, you're like, oh, what should I do for, you know, this, what should I wear tonight, blah, 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 like all this mind wandering, and what the brain really does at that point when you're not engaging in a task is integrates experiences of that day with who you are. So does anybody understand, like, when I say we associate our experiences with who we are, right? Like that's just part of being human. It's kind of pathological when those things are too separated, and that happens in trauma actually. People like don't think that they did that, or they don't identify with that person. Normally, these three things are talking to each other and you're updating who you are based on your experience, and who you think you are changes the way you act in your experience and all that. So all of that is connected. So what stress does, chronic stress does, is it impairs the balance and connectivity between these three networks, and all three of them, okay? So three things can happen. One, saliency network takes over. We already talked about that. That's the impulsive stuff. You're panicking. You're more likely to panic. So I call that the panicker. we talk about types. So the panicker is emotional regulation, and strategic thinking goes down. Now, default mode network can take over. And what that does is it decreases task focus, because remember it's opposite of doing a task. And it increases execution, and task focus goes down. It increases mind wandering. And what that does is it makes it more likely for thoughts that are task irrelevant to interfere with the task. For example, one example that we witnessed here was there was an officer that was about a mentally ill person was shooting at them. She was about to shoot, but hesitated, and then said, well, there's all this things going on in the world, you know, like public pressure, you can't shoot a mentally ill person, and etc. So that, like, the extra piece of information that is task irrelevant, because the person's already shooting at you, right, interferes more if your default mode network is highly active. And that's the kind I say hesitator, right? So stress can do both of these things. Stress can panic you, but stress can also, and act fast, but also make you hesitate, okay? I like this cartoon. It says, we have two options: boldly tackle the challenges ahead, or hold off and hope an asteroid strikes. So that's what a active default mode network does to you. All right, and then this is more rare, but sometimes executive control network can be overactive. This is a subtype of PTSD, actually. Normally PTSD is associated with hyperreactivity, but 15% or so of the PTSD cases tend to be under-responders, and they're sort of more rigid, they're the overthinker, under-responder, they just don't emotionally get activated enough, and that can also happen for after trauma or after chronic stress. So stress can, the point here is stress can show its face in many different ways. It's important to kind of recognize those. It's not always high, you know, the traditional fight or flight hyperreactivity. It could be being too underreactive, or it could be, you know, not acting when you should. All right, just jumping ahead a little bit. This is my favorite brain area, so I just wanted to share it with you guys. It's called the insula. Maybe you guys have heard of the amygdala being activated. So insula is like amygdala's best friend. It sits next to it. It's part of the limbic system. It gets less attention than it should, so I am advocating for it. It's part of the saliency network, so it gets activated every time there's a threat, every time there's something to pay attention to. It's the main job of the insula, among many jobs, is orchestrate the brain-body connection. So here, you know, I talked to you about the 3 brain networks, but then there's the whole connection to the body, right? So the insula is the part of the brain that does that, okay? And it's not just one-way monitoring of the body, like, or one-way commanding of the body. Like, it is a two-way communication. So it's listening to the body all the time, but it's also interpreting with the body's reaction with everything that's happening, and then sends body back the signal to either keep doing what it's doing or to shut down, threat is over, etc. So it is that communication piece that is done in this part of the brain. And this is a real human brain, by the way. All right, the cool thing about the insula, it is disproportionately enlarged in humans relatively to monkeys. So it's 30% larger in humans. We always talk about the frontal lobe, the thinking being larger in humans, but another thing that makes humans really unique is our brain-body consciousness. And that is, I think, why we have a 30% larger insula compared to the monkeys. All right, why do I talk about this? Because in the second part, we'll talk how a lot of the interventions that have been proven effective actually change the insula activity, actually impact the mind-body connection. So insula activity, as science shows, increases with anxiety, and it's linked to diminished perceived control. So if you're an anxious person, or if you're repetitively put in threat situations, your insula is hyperactive. What that does is now you're also more sensitive to the signals of your body. So things, I've seen this here too during the training. You cannot listen to your heartbeat all the time and interpret it like your body is listening to your heartbeat as insula is listening to your heartbeat, and also listening to everything else going on. But if you pay too much attention to your heartbeat, then it will trigger more anxiety about it. It's kind of like, there's a term for it in clinical literature, like health anxiety, or what do you call hypochondria? Yeah, so listening too much to the body, right? So that's what happens with anxiety. You start actually, not only do you have an increased heart rate, but you also start worrying about your increased heart rate, which adds to it, right? And that's because of this thing firing like crazy. All right, so here this is transitioning, but in general, I would say, as we're transitioning to what to do about it all, is don't worry about lowering your stress. Stress is not something that is high and that you lower. Stress is something that messes up connections between different parts, whether it's connection between different parts of your body or connection between your body and your mind, okay? So when you're thinking about what to do, focus on repairing those imbalances, particularly mind and body, and that's why I think these interventions work, because body is something we can easily access. It's hard to change those connections in your mind, but with your body, if you can exercise, you can pay attention to your body, you can meditate with your breath, all of those things will help with this stress regulation. All right, so part B takeaways, part 1B takeaways. Chronic stress impairs the communication between these 3 brain networks. It's usually going through changing the activity and the connectivity of the insular region in your brain. And the goal of the interventions is repairing these broken connections between the brain and the body and between the different parts of the brain. All right, before we move on to part 2, anybody has a question? Yeah.
So brain, body, consciousness, is that kind of like bodily kinesthetic? Like being able to move your body in the way you want your mind to?
Yes.
That's the insula, right?
Right.
Is there any other animal in the animal kingdom that has a bigger insula than humans?
No.
Has any studies been done on like apes or chimpanzees that use tools and they're like the insula, you know, the size of their brain or the change? Because that's all I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Super nerdy question, I'm sorry.
I don't know that there's any insula studies in apes. Yeah, I don't know.
Justin, let's get on it.
It's also, I mean, there's been studies on the motor cortex, because a lot of that movement is by the motor centers. Sure. Insula is more of a, it's not necessarily movement, but it is about where things are.
Spatial awareness.
Yeah, spatial, and also it gets temperature input, it gets touch input, and emotional input. So it's more of an internal state monitoring than a motor movement. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Interesting. That's it.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, move on. So before we get to this part, maybe everybody take a deep breath. It's been a long day. Fully exhale. Okay, back connected. All right. Breathing. So method 1, deliberate breathing. So why does this work? Because it's super intuitive and evolutionarily based. Our brains have evolved to increase anxiety in response to breathlessness, right? It's one of the most innate fears, is you just increase anxiety if you're in danger of suffocation. So in your brain, breath, which is sensed by high carbon dioxide, so if you're not breathing properly, you're gonna increase the level of carbon dioxide in your blood, which is gonna be sensed by your brain, will increase anxiety. That's just how our brains are wired, okay? So you can see that if you just breathe properly, that's gonna decrease anxiety. Just kind of do the opposite, okay? But that's not the whole thing. It turns out anxiety also makes us hyperventilate and not breathe properly, right? So you get into a vicious cycle. You've maybe heard of hyperventilation. People sometimes hyperventilate and not exhale properly, but just keep inhaling. That is a great way to increase anxiety because it will increase carbon dioxide levels in your body. So this is a vicious cycle between high carbon dioxide and anxiety that's evolutionarily based. Now, deliberate breath work breaks the vicious cycle. Because once you do it deliberately, you're already lowering carbon dioxide directly in your bloodstream, and therefore you're keeping your anxiety, that circuit that's already there, at a low place, right? Because you're already keeping low carbon dioxide in your blood. But also, if something comes, there's a threat, and if you can, in that moment, remember to breathe properly, you are now you're cutting this connection, you're preventing your anxiety to feed back into that carbon dioxide circuitry, right? Because things are happening, but I'm not gonna change my breathing to make my brain even more anxious. My brain is already hyped up, I'm already in the saliency network mode, but if I change my breathing too and start hyperventilating, if I don't breathe properly, then I'm gonna add up to that. And that's what we don't want, right? So it basically, breathing in the moment, but also breathing just outside of the moment, doing your breathing every day, or just being aware of your breathing, will lower your baseline anxiety and also improve lower your response to an anxious response to a threat. So not all breathing techniques are the same. This is just a new study still in review that's done by us, myself, and then my two bosses, Andrew Huberman and David Spiegel at Stanford. Not all breathing is the same. Exhale breathing is superior in improving mood, anxiety, and it also lowers respiratory rate. So here in the study, we compare 3 types of breathing and meditation. So for exhale focused, box breathing, which you might have heard of, which is inhale and exhale equal, so just kind of do a box, right? And then inhale focused. We found that exhale focused breathing, that I will tell you about in a second, is superior. This is just showing the improvement over time in mood. Also reducing anxiety. We found exhale focused breathing was the most effective out of the 3. With box breathing was also effective. They were all effective. You have to see that they're all under 0, so they're all reducing anxiety compared to baseline. But exhale focus is the most effective. And then we also found that people who did 5 minutes of exhale focused breathing every day showed a reduction in their baseline respiration rate, so baseline respiratory rate after 3 weeks. And this didn't happen with any other groups. So this is really cool because if you're doing it deliberately, it will lower your respiration rate naturally. So you're a lot less likely now to go into a hyperventilation mode from a lower respiratory rate. So what's the actual protocol? So what do I mean by exhale breathing? We call it the cyclic sighing protocol, and it, Justin talked about it in training a few times. Well, sighing is our body's natural response for a release, right? We just go at the end of a long day, or so we already have that mechanism. And so we basically, took that science and said, well, why don't we do that deliberately? Why don't we deliberately sigh and see what happens? So if you want to try it right now, how you do it is you inhale fully, and then you inhale again, make sure your lungs are filled, and then you exhale as long as you can, the longest exhale. So if you want to do it with me, I go. And you repeat. And if you do this for 5 minutes a day, I guarantee you your anxiety levels will go down, and your respiratory rate will go down. Now, the cool thing is you can practice this anytime, and it also works in the moment. So you can do it even in the middle of a call. You don't have to sit down and do it for 5 minutes. You can do one or 2 breaths. You can do it on your way to a call, just the longest exhale that you possibly can, 1 or 2 times. It will bring your nervous system down. It will silence the cell-NC network. Make sense? Method number 2, mindfulness meditation. Okay. So I think meditation sometimes has a bad reputation. I hear that in this department you guys already have a meditation app, so that's awesome. But I think generally people have a wrong perspective or knowledge about meditation. I want to kind of talk about that a little bit. Myth number 1 is meditation is passive. So typically when people talk about meditation, it's about doing nothing, sitting, right? Quite the opposite. If you look at what happens to the minds of the meditators, it's actually it's a practice of active attention. So it is actively attending to one thing for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, which is a very difficult thing to do. I don't know if some of your meditators, it's not easy to actively attend to a single thing. So it is basically mental training, right? 2 is you should not get distracted during meditation. So the goal of the meditation is just to sit still and not get distracted. That's not true at all. Of course we get distracted, everybody gets distracted. The goal is awareness of that distraction and bringing it back. So again, it's developing that mental muscle to bring things back. And then finally, primary goal of meditation is to relax. Usually you feel better after meditation. Usually you feel relaxed. Not always. Some people get more anxious because things start coming up. But that's not the goal of meditation at all. It's actually about achieving and improving control. Because its primary goal is to, through awareness, achieving control. So you being aware when you're getting close to your red zone, and then being able to control it, being able to let that go, right? Not get dragged by it. So the primary goal of meditation is to control over your state, not relaxation, not passive sitting, active control. So how does meditation do this? This is really cool research coming up in the last 10 years or so. And we now know that meditation actually improves the connectivity of the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So this is when we're talking about the executive brain and the saliency network. So meditation improves that connection, so you're better able to control your saliency network activity. It reduces the activity of the insula, so that's awesome. This study was actually done in Marines who received a mindfulness-based training. They showed a pre-deployment. They showed an attenuated insular response during an aversive breathing challenge. So what happened was they were told to breathe, and then intentionally their carbon dioxide levels were increased in the breathing room, and Marines that were trained in mindfulness for 8 weeks were able to keep their calm despite the carbon dioxide level increasing. So that speaks to the power of meditation in controlling your state. And then it also reduces the default mode network activity, as evidenced by these 2 new studies. And what that does is higher cognitive control, higher task execution focus, lower mind wandering. So that's the part where you can stay focused on the task and not think about, at that time, the public view and other things and that might be going on in your life, but just only focus on that incident that you're trying to resolve. And there are other benefits of mindfulness meditation that I'm not going to get into, but generally takeaways are it improves focus and cognitive flexibility and self-regulation, it reduces anxiety and mind wandering, and it reduces respiratory rate too. So how do we meditate? How much is enough? So the formula here is enjoyment times frequency times duration is optimal benefits. So if you can't meditate, if you just can't, then don't meditate, right? So you have to enjoy it, you have to at least feel good about it, to stick with it. It's, from all of these things that I tell you about today, the most important thing is sticking with it. So if breathing is easier for you, just do cyclic sighing breathing, a few minutes a day, and that's it. I forgot about meditation. Maybe you'll try it next year. But, so that's why I say enjoyment is a huge part of it, because that will influence the frequency and the duration of how much you practice. Now, how much is enough? Well, science shows, there are studies, multiple studies. One says 4 weeks is not enough for long-term benefits, 6 weeks or more. The other one says 8 weeks did the job, but 4 weeks didn't. So the consensus seems to be that 4 weeks is not sufficient. You need to at least do 6 or more weeks of daily meditation to start seeing the benefits. Majority of the meditation studies are done with an 8-week, 20-minute per day program. I know that's a lot for a lot of people. It's a lot for me to sit down 20 minutes. But I stick to 5 minutes, and our study showed 5 minutes is sufficient for daily benefits, and then it starts showing long-term benefits after 6 weeks. So if you can do 5 minutes a day, that's great. At least start there. You might find yourself increasing it as time goes by. All right. Any questions about breathing or meditation? Yeah or no? Okay, good. Okay, this should be method number 3, hypnosis. So how many of you have heard of hypnosis, clinical hypnosis? Yeah, okay. So it's, I want to talk about the myths again here. It's not very popular, I think, as meditation. but it is an incredibly effective tool to regulate anxiety and stress. It's been scientifically proven to regulate anxiety and pain in a lot of studies. So again, when you say hypnosis, people think about stage hypnosis. There is, in fact, hypnosis is a science-backed technique that's been shown to reduce pain and anxiety. It's used in clinical settings. So yes, can be used on the stage as well, just because our brains have that capacity, but it is mostly studied in clinical context. Hypnosis makes you lose control over your actions because you're now clown, you can do whatever the hypnotist tells you to do. That's not the goal of hypnosis, obviously. It's actually quite the opposite. What it does is it disconnects you from wrong actions, wrong memories, or negative experiences, and it reconnects you, gives you more control over interpretation of those bad experiences. And I'll talk about that. You need someone to hypnotize you. You actually can self-hypnotize, and now there is an app for it. I'll talk about that also. So it is accessible, just like meditation and breath work, is the point. So the neurobiology of hypnosis is that stress and trauma can cause rigid connectivity between the me network, the default mode network, and the central executive network, right? So what that does, if they're rigidly connected, is our sense of self is defined now by that experience. And this happens a lot with trauma victims. They connect to that experience and they feel, their shame, guilt. It's almost more easier for typically trauma victims to say they were guilty, they must have caused it some way, than to accept that horrible thing that happened to them out of nowhere, right? That's easier to accept. So that's why the trauma puts your sense of self with that negative, attaches it, because you want to stick to that belief for survival. Because if you accept the fact that something terrible happened to you, that's really scary, because then something terrible can happen to you again, right? So that's what trauma does. So now our traumatic experience is tightly connected to our sense of self. What hypnosis does is it disconnects it. The hypnotic state, it just loosens that connection. And when that's disconnected with hypnotic suggestions, the hypnotist or the digital app can reconnect your sense of self with a more positive experience. So a lot of times you can see people walk you through it. Imagine yourself taking a warm bath or whatever, on a beach, whatever is a positive experience. In a hypnotic state, you're able to connect to that, your sense of self to that instead of the trauma. And it's like magic, it works within minutes, if it does. So I'll come to if it does. So it repairs its connections. How to practice hypnosis. So traditionally, you go to a hypnotherapist's office and they hypnotize you. Now there is an app for it, and I'm not in any way connected to this app business, but it's called Reverie, and it's done by my boss, David Spiegel, at Stanford, who's a world expert in hypnosis. And there you can, listen to his voice and do these 5-minute hypnotic sessions. They show 60% reduction in stress and anxiety after a single session. So that's worth maybe a try. The only caveat with hypnosis is hypnotizability is a trait. So if you are not very hypnotizable by nature, then you're not going to benefit from hypnosis. So there's a way that on the app he walks you through it, and you can kind of determine your own hypnotizability, or maybe you already know it. It's like how suggestible you are to things. Generally, it's correlated with how hypnotizable you are. So that's the only caveat. And the Dr. Spiegel has an episode in Huberman Lab podcast about hypnosis. If you want to learn more, I would encourage you to listen to this episode of the Huberman Lab podcast. And we will be recruiting for a stress intervention study in 2023, where you can get, if you participate, a 6-month free subscription to the Reverie app. So if you're interested in trying it free, you can also keep an eye on that Stanford study. All right, method 4, mindset. I love this cartoon. It says, personally, I don't see the big deal about the ice bucket challenge. So it's all about perspective, right? It's how you frame it changes everything. And I don't have a ton here, but I want to talk about a particular study that's classic on the mindset world, which is the hotel room attendance study. In this study, hotel room attendants were divided into 2 groups, and one group was told that their level of work activity every day actually meets the Surgeon General recommendations for an active lifestyle, and it's really good for them. And the other group was not told this. And then, when they, 6 weeks later, they checked all the fitness markers there is, and almost all of them, like BMI, weight, actual physical exercise, almost all of them improved in the group that were told that what they were doing is good for them, compared to the group that was not given that information, even though they both moved the same amount. Okay, so that's pretty magical, I think, that just reframing what you're doing is this good for me can actually lower the negative consequences of that thing, if there is, and increase the positive consequences of that thing. Same thing goes for stress. Same group, Elia Crum's group, did this study where this was done in a financial institution, I think in a bank, and employees were given videos, 3-minute videos, that either taught them stress is debilitating, or gave them nothing as the control, or told them stress is enhancing. And at the end, they looked at their own stress perception, they looked at health symptoms, including cortisol, they looked at work performance, and all of these measures, the group that got the stress is enhancing video did better, right? They decreased their health symptoms, increased their work performance. Even their work performance was increased by just this 3-minute video about stress. So it's not only how you frame the threat, which is important, but also how you frame what's happening to you. So if your heart rate is increasing, you know you're stressed, you can say, well, this is good for me, I'm learning. I'm learning this, or you know, it's part of the job. Just framing it as opposed to stress is debilitating, that's just not gonna help anybody, right? And it is good for you, frankly, because that's what your job and that's what your life is, and this is another opportunity to practice. So that's something to keep in mind. And finally, and this is where I'm gonna end, training. We talked about how law enforcement training must aim to teach officers to be comfortable in the vigilant zone, because if not, there's a tendency to go to the red zone just because of our biology. Remember, you cannot change a threat, but it doesn't matter, because you can change. What matters is the perceived threat, and you can change that by training. It turns out that in humans, physiology, so heart rate, in this case it was used heart rate, but generally there are better markers, and that's what we were using in our study. Is negatively correlated. It seems to be a dial between this connection of salience and executive control network. So what I mean here is, on the bottom graph is the heart rate, and on the top graph is activity of the saliency network, so that's your fight or flight response in pink, and the executive control network in green. Now, as the heart rate starts increasing, you see the saliency network is increasing and the executive control goes down. So it is correlated in face of a threat with how well you are able to keep your saliency network down and activate your executive control network. So that's really good, because we can change our physiology. Our physiology, our bodies, is our one handle to this whole brain, black box. So here's this is my opinion, and what we were trying to test this past week, is that realistic stress should be induced in training, and in conjunction with physiological monitoring, because it makes training more effective. Why? Because we've seen instances where an officer on the outside might be appearing to do the right thing, but still not self-regulating underneath properly. And if that's the case, this could appear okay during training, but when you put them in a real life situation, they're at high risk for making a mistake. And you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be able to tie it to a particular event, right? But we saw a lot of instances where the person was constantly getting jacked up, but their partner jumped in, and so they were fine, right? But what happens if that wasn't the case? Now, use of force. Use of force could either be a fight response that is done instinctually, like they're in fight or flight zone, so they use their force, or it could be a conscious use of force decision. They remembered what their legal authority is, they made a conscious choice, right? How do we tell? We don't know why they did it unless we're looking inwards. So in general, physiological monitoring can be used to detect patterns of suboptimal self-regulation and interfere on an individualized basis. And this is what we did here, and this is what I'm working on with my team at Stanford, is this device that we put on officers' wrists as they were training. It's monitoring the skin conductance response, which is very widely studied in the lab as a monitor of autonomic nervous system activity. So it's literally reading your sympathetic nervous system, your acute fight or flight response. And we could link it, we don't have the video footage this time, but the idea is to link it to particular events that happen to see how well your response correlates with your physiology, and if there's anything you need to do to respond better. So here's an example from just this training. This was the same scenario. These are two partners, and these are two very different responses given by officers. So on top, this is what the signal is, basically autonomic nervous system activity. This officer, in red is when the action actually happened. So this officer is gradually climbing. It's gradually getting higher, higher, higher throughout the action. This officer went high up here, but then he or she was able to self-regulate very fast. And despite having these peaks in the middle, she never actually increased her baseline throughout the training. And that's what we want to see in a scenario. You're alert, you're responding to each threat in a moment, but you are not ramping up like that. And then this is a recovery period. Again, the officer went back to baseline, even below the baseline. This officer was showing some recovery, but then something must have happened during debrief, I don't know. And now they're here.
Dressing you a little rough for the debrief?
So, so this is I think important, because if there was a subsequent call, or if this scenario was even longer, now this officer has a very good chance that she or he is going to go into a cyclic cycle of fight or flight, whereas this officer will not, the bottom. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here and open up for questions. I would say the three takeaways is prevent yourself from getting into the red zone. And best things we know about that, other than daily meditation, daily breath work, so you have to do things daily, right? You can't just rely on that one breath you're going to take in the middle of the scenario when the time comes. You have to do the daily work, but also cyclic sighing breath or sighing breath during the scenario or before on your way to the scenario would really help with that. Build mental resilience with daily mind-body connection, which I already talked about, those three techniques. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you do it every day. And then your body. Body and physiology, as I mentioned, it is not about lowering anything, it is about connection. So, and your body is the easiest thing to connect because it's tangible, you can touch it. So that's why breath is great, because you can also feel your breath. Breath is great because it is under your conscious control, but it's also subconsciously controlled, right? So you can have direct control over your whole system by consciously controlling your breath. Also your body. That's why exercise works as a great antidepressant, great anti-anxiety, right? Because you're working your body, you're getting yourself hyped up, and you're pushing your brain to feel it. When you're exercising, you're like, oh my God. I don't know, I mean, I feel like I can't think of anything else if I'm really in a high intensity training, and that's what you want to do. You want to be aware of your brain and stop your thinking. So anything to improve your body awareness. And training your physiology during training, not just your tactics. It has to be incorporated with the tactics, otherwise it's, you know, even the best tactics guy can make a big mistake if they don't know how to self-regulate, because they won't remember it. Their working memory is off. That's all I had for you. So I thank you for your attention, and any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I do this myself. I just want to see what the safest possible way to do this if I want to incorporate it. So we talk about this, the sign, which is good. It's very easy to incorporate that.
Yeah.
Prior to me ever doing any type of my own training, I'll do hyperventilation myself just to fire myself up really quickly and see if I can make good decisions
Yeah.
while I'm freaking out, right?
Yeah.
As an instructor, would that be a safe thing? Because traditionally it'd be like, hey, we're gonna do this aerobic activity really quickly, get you going and everything, right? Hyperventilation wise, is there something where it'd be like, hey, really quickly, we're gonna take a few deep breaths, in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out for like 30 seconds or something?
Yeah.
So there's obviously no injury from moving around or anything, but it's gonna get that elevation really quickly, get the brain firing, and then here we go, right?
If you don't know the person, I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay, that's
Because
fine.
it's not safe.
Yeah. That's, I do it to myself. I don't want to.
If you know the person and they're willing to try it, you know, because it will trigger anxiety. That's
Oh, yeah.
what you want to do, right? It will trigger anxiety if somebody's not ready for it, or if they're already anxious. It could make them more anxious and difficult to control. I've seen weird stuff happen with hyperventilation.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. If you have a psychiatrist on board.
I'll keep it personal.
Yeah.
So when you say to induce stress while training, how much stress, or how would you define stress? Is it like, you know, really intense stress, or back it off a little bit stress, or how would you define that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think a ton of stress is necessary to train for stress regulation. In fact, you know, what you guys are doing is plenty, I think. I don't think it's super stressful, but it is enough to elevate everybody, so that's what I've observed anyway. So that's another thing. These monitors can be used to see if it's actually elevating anybody's physiological and how much. And in my experience, both with the VR and with the scenario-based training, is plenty to work with. So you really actually want to train in the lower or like the medium stress zone and to get comfortable in it, but to do it well, right? So if you're in the medium stress zone, because you don't want to push anybody off limits in the training. This is, I think, that the problem with like things like buzz training, and like it's very risky. I know that's what they're trying to do, is to eliminate the guys, to pick the tougher ones. But from you know, actual if you have to train these guys or not, your goal is not to eliminate everybody. Then you want to stay in the medium stress zone and not push too hard. And I think with like typical police scenario training will do that. The important thing is to be able to measure that they are actually able to self-regulate there, and not, you know, as I said, I've seen a lot of times where, well, it ended fine, and you got lucky, or it didn't go there, and end of scenario next, but like, I'm not sure about this guy. Like, I'm not sure he's gonna do the next one. So I think there's plenty of things you can do with a medium stress scenario. So I wouldn't really try to optimize that. Having said that, there's one person who was an pilot, and like she was pretty low the entire time. So there are sometimes people who are already very good that could benefit from a higher level of stress because they're operating under very low conditions. But in my observations, it's very minor, like maybe 1 to 5% of the officers are like that. So most people are in the middle. So yeah, don't stress too much about making it more stressful. I think what it is plenty, if that makes sense. You can introduce more stressors, like by getting the guy closer to you, closing up the distance and playing around with those factors. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Are your sensors waterproof?
Not currently, but yeah.
Same idea.
I was having that same thought. I'm like, I would love to see what people's stress level is. Water safety is a big part of our program here, and I know, like, when I went through recruit school many years ago, that for me was the biggest stressor. It would be interesting to see how that affects performance for people, because if their stress level is so high, I can see their performance level going way down. Are we getting the most out of them and the best out of the training by putting them under that much stress in that environment? Would be my question.
Yeah, exactly. That would be my concern too, because of what I just said. Like, if they're not able to regulate a medium stress, they're not going to do any better in a higher stress. In fact, they're going to do much worse. So if you can't train them, then there's no point in putting them under that. It's kind of takeaway.
So what happens in the orange zone, if you take the scenario we did with the backpack, where they pulled the cell phone out of the backpack, that's kind of like that orange zone area where some people stayed in the yellow, then some people went to the red to like deadly force or whatnot.
Yeah.
So if you say we're not really capable of operating in the orange zone, what, are those like your only solutions, or both are kind of right, both are kind of wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it was a cell phone in the end, right?
Correct.
So the goal there is to recognize that, right? It's to be able to recognize it. But what happens with the people who go to the red zone is they assume it's something else, it's a gun, and they act. And that's usually because of use of force. I mean, I can't speak for tactics, like that's
Was that like a training issue or is that an experience thing?
the people who went
Like,
in.
can you train for that, or is that more of like you go based on your prior experiences?
I think you can train for, so all of these things, you can train for staying in that moment and staying focused on that task. And that comes, in my opinion, with more self-regulation. So if you're able to slow down how fast you go up that hill, then you'll be able to notice you have enough time, like brain time, to notice that that's a cell phone. But if you don't do that kind of thing, then it's basically based on you're left to your experience and your, what we call like your biases, like what happened last 10 times, I'm gonna go with that. That's basically what your salience network does. I'm just gonna go with that. I'm not gonna look at the situation. And that's risky, right? Because it might be different this
Yeah,
time.
'cause it's not a cell phone waiting kind of costs you the half second.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really, you gotta be alert and you gotta be ready to act, but only when the information is, I think, right? Only if there is a threat. If you end up shooting a guy that has a cell phone, that's a problem.
I think you touched on it earlier when you said that ideally you'll want that spike of, I'm a fully uniformed state
Yeah.
trooper, I am walking up to somebody and they looked at me and are digging in a bag. Like, normalcy doesn't merit that. So then the second you figure out it's a cell phone, you've spiked, you've assessed threat, and then you're able to come back down and not be like, what are you doing with the bag? Come over here. No, I gotta search you. Drop that bag, turn around, put your hands up. You're able to come right back down and be like, oh, okay, oh, you're just on the fence. Okay, yeah, sounds good. All right, well, have a good day. Does that kind of explain a little bit?
I think yeah, I think you said it exactly right. Is to be alert. I'm not saying you should like calm down and relax. You should be alert, but you shouldn't have your judgment be blurred. You should still be thinking about what is it, what if it's that I'm gonna do this, if it's this I'm gonna do that. All should be just not running in your brain still, so if he does pull a gun, you're ready.
I'm trying to avoid things that we talked about, tunnel vision is a big thing. If you can, I think you said it yesterday, Dr. when we were out loud, if you can, for a second, when that person's there, just for a split second, make yourself look away, you can help avoid the tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Which is huge, knowing your whole scenarios, your whole surroundings.
Yeah. Eye movements are huge in shaping the response. It's sort of like breath, where it's cyclically tied to anxiety, so how breathing impacts your anxiety and anxiety impacts your breathing. Same thing with your eye movement. Anxiety impacts your eye movement, you become more tunnel vision, your peripheral vision goes down. But similarly, if you just do a split second, or you don't have to do that in the middle of the scenario, you can do it going up to the scenario as well. So look around the environment for a split second. Just that scan will impact your to come down, because you're basically telling your brain, I'm not tunnel vision, I'm aware of everything that's going on. I'm not telling you to like sit, take a whole 10 seconds, look around and relax, but just that movement of your eyes will also help.
What was the scenario that you had up there? What was the scenario connected to that stress response?
That was, the first day, you guys had multiple people, there were 2 cars.
The felony stop.
Yeah,
Okay.
stuff, yeah. There were 4
That
people, I think.
makes sense.
There was 1 leader and talking.
Okay, yep, that makes sense then.
That was your acting in the car, driving them through the road.
You might not be wrong.
Was the person that was optimal, were they the ones speaking? Because when you speak, you're forced to breathe. You're forced to focus on something else.
Let's see, the one who was talking. I believe yes, actually.
That's
but,
if it's who I'm thinking
It's
of,
who-
yes.
You would be correct then.
That would make
Wow,
sense.
that's interesting.
You said you talking makes you relax?
Well, it forces you to deal with stress. You do
It forces,
involuntary,
yeah.
like screaming.
But not all people do as well as this person did still.
So I can explain the spike now, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the scenario basically, trade secret here, so don't spread it around. But, so we set them up for the felony stop. They are supposed to get out, go to the back of the car. That already is inducing stress because you just have a valid pursuit, car has crashed out, you're at the back of the car. So you start giving commands, and she's giving solid commands and probably is amped up because, is he listening, what's happening? So then he's amped up, starting to come down. That spike, our actor reaches out with a gun and starts firing at the students. So that's where that came from. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, makes
actually.
sense.
Vincent, we talked to you yesterday a little bit about, if you have partners, if one partner is able to regulate and the other one is not, that may be a point where if you know each other, where, hey, you take the lead on this one.
Yeah.
If that person on the top knows they're not good at bringing themselves down,
Mhm.
they might not wanna put themselves in that position. So with that, like I said, you can train people and let them know, who am I? How do I react under
Yeah.
stress? Because a lot of us don't know, we think we might know, but the physiology may show something different.
That's exactly right. I think it helps with self-awareness, how you deal with it. That one of the things that stress does is it kills self-awareness. So if you're already a stressed person, and this ties back to the mind-body connection, right? So because it blocks that connection, it cuts the connection, now you're no longer aware of your body state properly or not accurate. Body accuracy is one of the things that we call it interoception. Interoception is one thing that goes down in stress, so accuracy. People show up in the emergency room thinking they're having a heart attack, but they're actually having a panic attack. That's a great example of, being disconnected from your body to the point that you think you're dying. Emergency room workers actually recognize this. This is very common. But things like this can, in fact this, because it's not heart rate, can tell you that. It can tell you, no, you are not, you're really hyped up right now. That's why you're responding like this.
Have you done anything with stress and
have not done anything specifically with swearing, but I have done a preliminary study on two things. One, in the lab, in general population, not crops, I've correlated anxiety with talking, particularly women. So this is a gender difference thing. So females, actually I didn't have time to talk about it today, but I think I mentioned to some of you. Sorry, I'll answer the question and come back to female. But yeah, so more talking can be a stress, can be a sign of stress. Two, I did a study with MVPD, and I've seen that repetitive speech, so drop the gun, drop the knife, drop the knife, just getting stuck, correlates with that. So if you're not able to self-regulate properly, that tends to happen more. And so decline in communication, getting into that repetitive speech pattern, so your vocabulary gets very limited, is another sign of stress.
Because we have incidences, the higher stress incidences where, because we don't teach swearing, but we have troopers that will, if that's what they'll do, they will start swearing or using that language, and it's not, when we say we fall back to our training, it's not something that we train, so there's, I'm just kind of curious.
It's a fight response. You're fighting with your words. Yeah. Maybe it's not a situation where you need to use force, like shoot, but they're still hyped up and it's a fight response. Aggression. Yeah, and about the gender differences, majority of the studies on stress have been done in male mice, because that's majority of studies, everything is done in male mice, but also in humans, mostly males. And now there are more females. NIH actually 10 years back or so now made a requirement to have female mice in studies, which wasn't before the case. Similarly humans, and we're finding more literature is coming now that females actually don't have a fight or flight as much, but we have a tend and befriend response, or some even call it charm and disarm, which is sort of de-escalate and disarm. If you literally, it's not a law enforcement term, that's a scientific thing. They termed it charm and disarm. And so, and I've seen it in this training as well. Female officers sometimes tend to de-escalate situations where there's maybe needs for use of force or more aggressive posture. That could also be due to stress. So, it's about knowing what the response is, what the appropriate response is, and not falling back to your biases or your tendencies. So that's why I brought it up, is sometimes, and I do this too, I just make friends when I feel like I'm threatened, because if, then they're not gonna hurt me, right? So that's the response that you tend to do, and also protect the response against your babies and stuff like that, so it has an evolutionary sense. But you don't always wanna be friends with a mentally ill person who's, charging at you, so there's something to recognize, when we're talking about why this person made that decision. It could be due to stress, and that's their comfort zone. Otherwise, female officers are much better in de-escalation communication than male officers, if that's the right thing to do. It's another finding from the study. It's here. That's it. Oh, I didn't.
Some of them are better at.
Yeah.
I didn't say like it should be.
Yeah.
How much of this is influenced by your upbringing? I know that they go through the training, they learn all of the proper ways how to deal with things, but how does all of this affect when you're being brought up as your culture? Because some cultures deal with stressors a lot differently than some other cultures. So how does this affect it?
Very, very much influenced by how you're brought up, your culture, your family, but also your bigger community. I grew up in Turkey, for example, where policing is very different. It's very much, and the reason is nobody has guns in Turkey. Like, it's very difficult to get guns, so the probability of the cop, of course, bad guys probably also have guns, but illegally. So I think in general, cops don't have to deal with as much armed people, and therefore I don't think that they get that much like use of force training. It's all about like my first time here, I got pulled over by a cop. It's like 18 years ago, and I left the car, and I almost died because of that. And because that's what you do. You just come out and you have a conversation, and you're like, raise up your arms, and I was like, and no, I didn't have anything. So the biology of stress, the hormones is biological, right? It has nothing to do with the culture, but how we respond will change based on our upbringing, but also our culture, and probabilities of like perceived threat. If I think, for example, in a culture where there is no guns, the perceived threat is lowered naturally. And so if somebody saw me, with my backpack and glasses coming out, and in Turkey, they wouldn't perceive me as a threat. But here, oh my God, she left the car, right? That's uncompliant or whatever. So then that perceived threat is much higher. So it does influence where on that spectrum you're going to perceive the threat, and therefore your response, if that makes sense.
That's why it took 18 years to become a citizen. You're on a list after that.
That's right, there it is.
Very interesting.
Yeah, if you have other questions, please feel free to email me too. That's my email.
Great. Thank you very much for the
Thank
time.
you.
Very much. Appreciate it.